What if we walk upon a razor's edge of potentiality? Let's fall off the balance beam tonight as we change history. Paul's historical what ifs to Deep Fat Fried.
Deep Fat Fried.
Shit. Historical what ifs. What would have happened if shit hadn't done did what it done did? Yeah, that's my intro. That's my intro.
I don't even know, dude. I don't know what would have happened if things hadn't happened. Then something else would have happened.
Yeah, some other shit would have happened.
I mean, yeah,
and what would have happened if what done did happen didn't have happened.
Whoa. This is one of them thinky episodes, huh? One of them episodes where you got to use your brain power. Turn your brain on to maximum.
So,
I mean, look, these Egyptians had a good run and everything, but, I mean, hey.
What if, Scotty, the Egyptian Empire had not fallen?
Ooh.
So,
Oh, shit.
You know that the Nile River is an amazing place to start a civilization.
Oh, yeah.
Of course, the Egyptian Empire was built around it.
Right picture.
There we go.
So the Nile
That's
teemed with fish, edible fruits growing along the borders of it, just kind of like a paradise. You can see it here. I mean, look at it. It's like a paradise in the middle of the desert. And this is where they settled, a pretty good place to fucking start your civilization, right?
Fuck yeah.
So they developed agriculture. So it was really the Egyptians that developed mass agriculture as we know it, kind of the modern mass growing surpluses of food. And it led to huge wealth. Of course, that wealth was shockingly somehow concentrated at the very top. I don't know how that happened.
Very unusual. Doesn't seem to be a pattern throughout humanity at all.
Yeah.
It's very weird what happened.
The wealth was concentrated heavily with landlords, government officials, steep rents, steep taxes. Out of necessity, Egyptians invented a sophisticated and impressive irrigation system. So, they had it going for them. The height of ancient Egyptian civilization and its power was during the reign of Ramses II. So in the third year of his reign, Ramses started the most ambitious building project after the pyramids, built almost 1,500 years later. These are ancient temples in Thebes here that Ramses II made. He was also a successful military campaigner, took back territory, acquired new lands such as Syria and Israel through his battles with the Canaanites and Hittites. He was referred to as Ozymandias by the Greeks, who eventually took over the region. Not long after the death of Ramses II, Egypt fell heavily into decline. They were conquered first by Nubian kings, then the Assyrians. Egypt was able to expel the Assyrians and start rebuilding their society, but they were conquered again, this time by the Persians around 100 years later. Then in 332 BCE, Alexander the Great conquered Egypt from the Persians and started Greek rule there. So the question being, so here's the first kind of what if. What if Ramses hadn't overextended? Because he was this great military commander, gained all this territory for Egypt, but obviously pissed off his neighbors to the point where several of them came through and conquered Egypt. What if, he had held back his forces and invested in expanding his civilization at this point rather than conquering,
We'd all be speaking Egyptian right now, I think.
Yeah, Walk Like an Egyptian would be the national anthem. The Luxor in Las Vegas would be the capital of the United States,
Well, obviously. We have a giant temple instead of the White House. Be like, let's go to the White Temple today, kids. Walk through it.
So the Egyptians, their culture was pretty fucking based around, like, pretty similar to ours in a lot of ways. I know you have a fascination with Egyptian culture, Paul. But like the pyramids were not built by slaves; they were built by like wage workers and stuff.
Right, like they had press gang laborers. I mean, they were taken care of. They had they were fed and housed, and from what we know, you know what I mean? So this whole idea of like mass slavery in Egypt is heavily called into question by most historians.
Now, there are like instances, I guess, where, kings and queens were like buried with their servants and stuff like that. So there was that kind of stuff. I would hope that would kind of go away as technology improves and like science is discovered and shit like that.
I mean, but I really think the question we're asking here is how different history would have been. It would have been massively different.
Right.
So, at least
we're talking about, let's say that
antiquity.
Let's say that they were able to expel the Nubian advance because they weren't overextended. And then they were able to expel the Persians and expel the Greeks and continue to grow and influence as a culture, right? Because after Alexander the Great, it was Ptolemy, Alexander the Great.
The Ptolemies, yeah.
And it was the Ptolemaic dynasty. Ptolemy proclaimed himself the pharaoh in Egypt. And for
all the way to Cleopatra.
Yeah, for 300 years, there was a Greek pharaoh sitting at the head of Egypt. And Egyptians, to his credit, it wasn't like some brutal dynasty where they were like, you're all Greeks now. He's like, no, Egyptians kept practicing their religion. They weren't.
Well, Alexander had respect for Egyptian culture. Like, he had an appreciation for them. He liked the idea because they had within their culture built in the idea of like human beings walking the earth as gods and stuff. And he liked that because he believed that about himself. So,
like Greek and Roman cultures, that was like the ancient culture of the time to them. It's like, oh, it's Egyptian culture, right? Yep. Obviously, Mesopotamian cultures existed as well. The Assyrians were one of them. But yeah, I don't know. I mean, honestly, it would have just had, as far as that, a monumental shift. I mean, if they would never been conquered, really, I mean, that would have totally just shifted the balance of power. Like, would the Roman Empire have ever come about?
Well, let's talk a little bit about that. So, as we know, what we know is the Great Library of Alexandria was built during the Ptolemaic dynasty, that 300 years. Now, obviously, it wasn't this giant treasure trove of all human knowledge like it's painted to be, but it was a collection of ancient scrolls from Egypt and writings from the time, and was burned by Julius Caesar. So Egypt was eventually annexed by the Roman Empire in 30 BCE after the death of Queen Cleopatra. So according to legend, her husband, Mark Antony, stabbed himself with a sword, believing Cleopatra to already have killed herself. It's like a Romeo and Juliet tale, right?
Yeah.
Due to the collapse of their rule because of the Roman invasion, Cleopatra later did kill herself, supposedly by tempting a snake to bite her after Mark Antony died in her arms. These events are obviously heavily inspired Romeo and Juliet as a tale and are kind of apocryphal because who knows? It's very dramatic. You know what I mean? So maybe something like this did happen, but maybe not. You can imagine this time.
One thing I know doing this show is that fucking myth and fact get really strongly entangled the further back you go.
What we're hearing is kind of the legends in that culture. So like Roman culture was like, oh, he was madly in love with her. Because I mean, like, it was probably more of just a political maneuver. Like, they lost a battle. The Roman Empire was in its heyday or still expanding. So it was like, okay, you're fucked. That's it.
Right. So Caesar Augustus was the one that annexed Egypt with the assistance of Octavian and named the region Aegyptus. The Roman Empire had control of the region for 700 years. Like the Greeks, they mostly left the Egyptian region alone because besides demanding worship of themselves as gods. So that's not really leaving the region alone. Listen, do whatever you want, but you worship us as gods. You send us 20% of your fucking paycheck. Do whatever you want.
I mean, yeah, it was a client state. Well, I mean, as you said in the beginning, the Nile was a breadbasket. So, I mean,
and strategically very important to controlling the, what do they call that? The Mediterranean, right?
Yeah.
Well, yeah.
So the city of Alexandria became a key trading outpost for the Roman Empire. By some accounts, the most important for a time. It was also a leading scientific and technological center of the empire. Culturally, the city of Alexandria at times rivaled Rome in importance. Egypt was later taken by the Persians after the collapse of the Roman Empire. So it actually held by the Persians 2 times historically. One time after the death of Ramses II, and then again after both Greece and Rome ruled it. The Persians came back and took it again. So here's
Egypt
another
was
question.
an often conquered territory at a certain point. It just kind of bounced around, changing owners' hands a lot.
So here's another question that I think is interesting. Because the Romans were so hyperextended into Egypt and the Middle East, do you think they were more vulnerable to their own collapses because of it? And was Egypt with its resources worth the risk of becoming, irrelevant in history? Because if that's true, a lot of historians will tell you that both of these empires kind of crumbled because of overexpansion.
Well, I mean, if you think about it, like, you only have a certain number of people, and like honestly, the further out you expand away from like the throne, I mean, there's no mass communication at this time like we have now. Like you can't issue edicts from the throne that are going to be enacted in Alexandria quickly. It's like it takes a long time for information to travel. So
yeah, you basically have provinces and you have governors with that, and you have.
That's why they tried to do like this looser rule where it's like, do what you want, just give us our shit. That's like because they can't actually rule like that,
right.
Because they kind of like.
Well, the more distant you are from the people you're trying to rule, the less likely they are to show you the deference that you need to have them show you in order to maintain it. Rebel factions, enemy states see the weakness and start cannibalizing the outer places.
You kind of have to put people in those places that are like, you're in charge of this region, basically. Right. And you have to kind of act how you think I would want you to. And then you set information and stuff, but like today, obviously, you can rule like an empire that size because you could communicate information quickly and all that stuff. But now, or back in those days, you can't do that. So like, overextension is definitely an issue at that time.
The Romans didn't learn any lessons from the Egyptians, clearly. I mean, obviously, who knows how much they actually understood of the Egyptians' history. But of course, overexpansion.
The big overarching question is the one that I find the most interesting. It's like, let's say that Egypt didn't overextend itself during the reign of Ramses II and remained the dominant power in that region, and it was Egypt that slowly but surely colonized Europe.
I mean, they would probably have the same issue with overexpansion at some point.
Of course, but the culture would be completely different.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, like...
Would Western civilization exist in the same sense that we know it? I mean,
probably not, right?
Probably not at all.
Isn't it cool to speculate about what that would look like? You know what I mean? Like, if you could go back and look at the alternate universe where the Egyptian Empire pushed back the Nubians, pushed back the Persians, kicked the fucking Greeks back into the ocean.
Yeah, they're basically they take the role of the Roman Empire almost, and their expansion. Like, I mean, Egyptian culture definitely influenced all these other cultures for sure. I mean, but if they had actually been the dominant culture, I mean, their history would have been totally different. They would have colonized those places. They would have built monuments. They would have expanded much further. I mean, how far north we don't know, but those cultures would have looked totally different. Like the way that Rome is built in those places, like the modern marvels that people would probably be going to, they'd be going to Alexandria.
Let's remember too that like a lot of the dominant world religions of today kind of came around this time. So like the Egyptian religions, and the Egyptian gods might have a more, solid place on the pantheon, or even if, humanity kind of seemed like it was moving towards more monotheistic stuff, but it might have had a more Egyptian flavor.
Yeah,
we'd all be worshiping Horus or something.
Egyptians themselves, you have to remember, Egyptians themselves, Akhenaten was the name of the pharaoh that outlawed polytheism and made himself the center of the pantheon.
Right. So but as soon as he died, they pretty much were like, "Fuck him."
Right, but I'm just saying, like the seeds of that monotheism came kind of naturally out of Egyptian culture. So I think you're right that it would have been Egyptian monotheism eventually, probably.
Right, and I mean, like without the Roman Empire, you're probably not going to see Christianity become the dominant world religion. You're probably not going to see Islam spread the way it did.
Remember, I mean, as we all know, I mean, the center of Christianity
world power
in Europe, it was Rome,
right?
Roman Catholic Church.
Let's go. I mean, if we're going back in time, Egypt controls Israel. You know what I mean?
Right.
Where Judaism and Christianity have their fucking roots.
Yeah, this is where Horus died for us all.
So we're gonna be Horus worshippers or fucking Amon Ra.
We're gonna be building fucking elaborate houses and shit, and be like, when the afterlife, I'm taking all this with me. I got my 4-wheeler, my RV, all this shit.
Maybe we'd be buried with all our possessions or something like that. Who knows?
So let's fast forward a little bit in time, if you guys don't mind, to another time when world history hung on a razor's edge of potentiality. This time, World War II. This question was actually inspired by watching a couple of movies. I watched the movie Darkest Hour, which has Gary Oldman playing Winston Churchill, and then that inspired me to watch Dunkirk, which is about the part of
evacuation.
Yeah, the evacuation of France.
From France. Yeah.
So during the 1930s, Winston Churchill was on one of his frequent hiatuses from political office due to his controversial nature, but pushed heavily from the sidelines for the British military to increase its defenses as Nazi Germany rose in power. Remember, as Nazi Germany started the EU wasn't a thing yet. And so it wasn't like Great Britain immediately was like, oh shit, the Nazis invaded Poland or the Nazis did this. I mean, they were concerned about it, obviously, but their immediate response wasn't like, we must go save France. They were just kind of like, if the Germans control France, are they going to keep paying us trade deficits?
And the history of Europe is so fraught with conflict. It's like, you don't want to get embroiled in a conflict because that can embroil the entire continent.
So as he was called a warmonger by his own party for saying like, hey, this Hitler guy is a problem. Churchill was reappointed to office in the role of First Lord of the Admiralty at the start of World War II in 1939 and appointed a prime minister in 1940. So after shitting on him for being right, they were like, all right, Winston, save us. So Winston made this symbol famous, V for victory. He's actually kind of infamously flipped it around one time and did one of these, being so upper crusty that he doesn't know that this is fuck you. You know what I mean? And so he was in the newspaper throwing up one of those. Love that shit. V for victory here, the gesture that would often perform for the press. However, behind the scenes, his closest advisors were pressuring him to consider meeting with Mussolini to broker a peace deal and thus possibly a surrender to Hitler. The situation looked dire for the United Kingdom. Their ally France had fallen, and the British military was short on men trying to defend them, ships, weapons. Churchill didn't end up meeting with Mussolini and eventually did lead the United Kingdom to victory, along with a lot of help, obviously, in 1945 by overseeing its involvement in the Allied war effort. So 383,700 members of the British military lost their lives in World War II, and 67,100 British civilians during the bombings.
Bombings of London, yeah.
So, in order to better discuss the hypothetical of Churchill surrendering to Hitler, let's look at France and other allies which did surrender. They were subjected to conscription in the German military, forced labor in Germany for the war effort, and 49 Jewish concentration camps were built just in France alone. So they just basically became a place where France could do its dirty business. 77,500 Jewish people died in France, about a quarter of the Jewish population there. It was worse in the Netherlands, which was also occupied and saw 75% of its Jewish population executed. Nearly 75,000 inhabitants killed, 550,000 tons of bombs dropped. France was, after Germany, the second most severely bomb devastated country in Western Front. This is what was at stake for Great Britain. Germany was not kind to the nations that it was taking over. It was not looking to be a kind ruler. It really genuinely is moving forward with a sense that the German people had a divine right to rule Europe. And if you didn't believe that, you're fucked. Now, if you were willing to join us and be a Nazi, then hey, come on over. But anybody that was like, hey, this is France. No, it isn't. You know what I mean? And Great Britain was really looking down the barrel of that. The whole massacre at Dunkirk and Calais, when the fucking British and French resistance was pushed all the way to the sea, right? That was it. That was the last of the British military, basically, on that beach. And so it was very dire.
The ships to evacuate. I mean, that's why Christopher Nolan decided to make a movie about it. 'Cause, I mean, it's a dire situation. It's basically a bunch of... They got bailed out by a bunch of just fishermen and people with boats. Like, anyone had a boat was like, come pick these guys up and take them back to Britain.
Well, they called it
the English Channel.
Yeah, they called it the civilian fleet. And it was basically Churchill's idea. He called on every boat and pleasure craft that can hold 3 men or more to be mobilized immediately to Dunkirk and to load itself up beyond capacity and float back to fucking Great Britain. So it saved a lot of men's lives. But in order to do so, he walked right on the edge of having to succumb to his party. They were ready to throw him out with a vote of no confidence as prime minister and make another person prime minister who was way more amenable to sitting down with Mussolini and having Mussolini broker talks with Hitler for a peaceable surrender, right? So the question is, how crucial was the United Kingdom to the Allied war effort? Would the independent Great Britain dominions of Australia, Canada, New Zealand, and South Africa have stayed if their mother nation fell? It's a good question. Would the British colonies still have supported the Allies? Had the men from the United Kingdom been conscripted and forced into labor by the Germans? Would the Axis powers have the upper hand in manpower? Like, would it have obviously it would have made it harder for the United States to come in and Russia to come in and, deliver a death blow to the German army if they had spread all the way, if they didn't have opposition up north. So there's another one of those things that really could have changed the face of this war, in my opinion. I don't know how you guys feel about it.
Oh, I mean, completely. I mean, you have the fact that the English Channel really just saved the United Kingdom from being just completely rolled over. Because, I mean, that just adds another logistical nightmare. And that's what the army is, what it is. It's a logistical nightmare. I mean, the Germans bombed the hell out of London. I don't think the other allies would have stayed with them, though. If they had said the surrender, I think they would have known the surrender was like this. Like, oh, we're surrendering. You know what I mean?
Guys, you got to remember, while this was going on, the United States had not yet entered the war. And so Churchill would call fucking LBJ, or not LBJ, FDR or whatever.
FDR.
And say,
they had London lease, which basically just they gave them tanks and shit.
Yep.
And said and they made it, the description at the time was akin to like giving someone a fire hose. It was like, look, there's a fire, and you need to put it out. I'm letting my neighbor borrow a hose. There's basically fighting Nazism. There's
a scene in the movie where he asks, Mr. President, we sure could use a few destroyers. And, FDR goes, well, old chap, I'll take a look. There's a fishing trawler, I believe, that I might be able to get over there to you. Would that help? And Churchill just gets this look on his face and then he says, yes, Mr. President, anything you can do will help. You know what I mean? It's just like, so he was really out under a lot of pressure from both sides of the political aisle in Great Britain to save what was left of Great Britain's culture by submitting itself to the rule of this Axis power.
I mean, and I think as we know, if they don't have the United Kingdom as the launching point to attack France and the Nazi positions there in Europe, it's going to be a lot harder to invade. Where they get so they're going to have to land on the United Kingdom, or they're just going to have to land from the U.S. Or some remote island. That's going to make it much harder to invade Europe that way. Obviously it was when the United States entered, and of course, when the Hitler violated the non-aggression pact with Stalin, that changed everything in the war as well.
Yep.
But I think it'd been much harder for the U.S. to really have invade. Maybe we could have still prevailed in that way.
Possibly.
Maybe Northern Ireland they could have launched it, but they wouldn't have had the support of the government there. Obviously, if there's fighting and stuff going on, it makes it much more difficult for the U.S. to enter the war. And it was still a hell of a battle, even with the U.S. and as big of a country as we are. There was the Germans. The Battle of the Bulge, the biggest battle the U.S. Army ever had, which is the Germans basically pushed the Allies almost back and almost broke the Ally lines, which completely would have changed the war again. Yeah. So there's a number of crazy things. Talk about just Britain itself. It would have had a massive impact on the war. I don't know if we would have went the same way. The United States might have said, let's make peace.
Here's a major impact it would have had. The Allies relied heavily on British citizen and scientist Alan Turing.
True.
He was a code breaker.
Code breaker.
Yep. So he basically, he didn't invent the Enigma machine, but he invented the technology that allowed the Enigma machine to work. So had he not been available to the Allies to do that, it's very possible that they couldn't have compromised German communications in the way that they did, and Germany could have maintained its upper hand situation, being, having its U-boats move under cover of secrecy and troop movements be secret. So that's another huge one.
The U.S. might have sued for peace.
It could have also been the case that this might have just spread Germany even more thin, allowing the Soviet Union to maybe even have an easier run of them, or maybe Hitler wouldn't have gone. Maybe Hitler wouldn't have broken his truce with the Soviets so quickly. I don't know.
Well, let's say Hitler steamrolls the UK, he takes over. He's got that. then maybe fighting Stalin isn't such a big deal.
I mean,
he's not fighting the Allies.
It could strengthen him or it could weaken him. I mean,
many French people were conscripted and fought for the Nazis. So it's just like how, you know,
get script, but they, you know, the English were already having trouble, you know, finding enough fighting men as it was. But
well, that's what I'm saying though. They could have just absolutely decimated that fucking country and used it as just a strategic point, used the fucking access to the channel to literally cut off access to the English channel with, you know,
you have
German
to ask too,
bases on both sides.
Would there have been a thing where, like, if the country surrendered, would there have been a lot of active resistance within the country the way there was in France?
Probably so.
That would have been something that the Germans would have had to deal with, you know, as
well, of course,
like a lot of terrorist activity as people viewed them as illegitimate rulers and shit. Maybe making their rule a little bit hard to maintain and destabilizing it a bit. But I mean, I don't know. It just seems like it would have been a huge boon for Hitler, obviously, to fucking have the, you know, I mean, UK surrender to him. I mean, I don't see how that would be a bad thing.
An actual surrender that society, that the society would be accepted. Like, we're a vassal state, we're a client state now. I mean, that would be the ideal.
Well, that's what that's what Churchill, that were urging Churchill to do something like that. So
when it comes to Turing, one more thing, due to the problems of counterfactual history, which is what we're doing here today, by the way. This is our way of saying it is what if, but we're actually engaging in a philosophical exercise called counterfactual history. This is a real thing that people do. It's hard to estimate the precise effect that Turing and his ultra intelligence had on the war. However, one professor estimated that his work shortened the war in Europe by more than 2 years and saved over 14 million lives. So
I'm not surprised.
After the Conservatives' defeat in the 1945 general election, Winston Churchill became leader of the opposition. Amid the developing Cold War with the Soviet Union, he publicly warned of a, quote, iron curtain of Soviet influence in Europe and promoted European unity. So he was pretty based for his time. He was like, perhaps we should have the EU in 1945. It took him a little while to get around to that. He lost the 1950 election, but returned to office the following year in 51. That's just kind of the way this shit works in Great Britain. His second term was preoccupied with foreign affairs, especially Anglo-American relations, because they were so indebted to us after we came back. And our connection became so much more solidified as allies at that point. But you know, his job was tied up dealing with the big, giant, rampaging gut baby that was America now. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And, you know, the preservation of the British Empire was big to him. Keeping all of their, you know, client states was big to him. He's a big nationalist. Yeah,
keeping the Commonwealth together.
Yeah. Domestically, his government emphasized house building, developed a nuclear weapon. In his declining health, Churchill resigned as prime minister in 1955, although he remained an MP until 64. Upon his death in 65, of course, he got a big, giant state funeral. Big hero of the British people here.
Sure.
As we're kind of leading into the end of this, one final round of questions for you guys to ponder with me. Churchill certainly wouldn't have remained in power if he had surrendered. Without Churchill's influence and warnings, would the Cold War possibly have been supported throughout Europe? So is it possible that Europe might have sided with Russia without, you know, the kind of direct opposition that Winston Churchill threw up immediately? Would the Cold War have been less deadly if the British weren't trying to keep communism out of their colonies? So, yeah, maybe if there wasn't a Winston Churchill, maybe things would have went smoother. You know, I don't know. The Cold War would have been less pronounced, maybe.
Yeah, I mean, when there's change, there's always going to be if you change the order of things, the societal upheaval is sure to follow. So, I mean, even if people had been more like, "Oh, okay, communism, let's see what that's about,"
and then
there's still going to be a lot of people.
Well, immediately after,
let me ask one more real quick, TJ, for you to ruminate on. Just like without a strong, newly empowered Great Britain, would Russia have gained even more power in Europe? You know,
I mean, after
almost certainly
at the end of World War II, I mean, most people credited the bulk of, you know, defeating Hitler and the Germans with the Russians. Like most people said, like they had more to do with liberating France and all this other stuff.
Yeah.
But you know, America, I guess, had better propaganda, so we've kind of like
It was actually
we've kind of made ourselves the star of that show.
I mean, yeah, we definitely were instrumental in it, but I mean, the Soviet Union was,
absolutely.
I mean, it was a meat grind. I mean, they sent people in. I mean,
they just threw bodies in front of the guns and mines and shit. That's what we did. It was horrible. Right. But we were Johnny come lately to this war, and really the Russians did the hard fight. They literally pushed the Nazi army, the Red Army pushed the Nazi army from Stalingrad all the way to Berlin.
Right. Yep. So I mean, like, we're talking like the Germans had way more to do. I mean, I'm sorry, the Russians had way more to do with winning the war. So I mean, like, I think there was probably like sort of
and yet again,
a fear of the Russians at that point.
Ignoring history, Napoleon invaded fucking Russia in winter, and he got his ass fucking kicked. Don't fucking invade Russia in winter, motherfuckers.
Or maybe don't invade Russia. I don't know if the winter thing matters as much as people think it does, because maybe they stalemate you during the summer, and then the winter comes and your ass is entrenched in fucking 10 miles of snow.
Hitler was pushing.
But here's the thing. It's like, I think that...
what's the thing, too? If Hitler had to bail out Mussolini, another counterfactual thing there, and he had been able to invade Russia sooner, I think they probably would have conquered Russia.
But think about this.
Would they have held it? Would they have held it?
Though, like, after Russia pulled that shit off, I mean, like, the United States and Britain and all these countries are probably kind of looking at Russia like, fuck.
Well, Russia's like, we had to fight this massive fucking war.
But people used to look at Russia like that's just a big backwater filled with fucking stupid barbarians and shit. That was like the attitude towards Russia prior to that.
Dude, you remember when we covered the night witches and shit? They were incredibly sophisticated, incredibly brave, incredibly competent.
Right, but I'm saying soldiers. prior to World War II, like, people didn't think much about Russia. It was just they're kind of like whatever. They're backwoods fucking.
Yeah, they missed the European Enlightenment.
Well,
so it's kind of like that's Russia,
and their empire had fallen to revolution and shit, and they were looked at as like a weakened and backwards Orthodox state.
Right, but I mean, after that, I mean, like, people looked at Russia with like a certain degree of fear. It's like, holy shit.
They had to.
They're a power on this fucking world stage.
They literally marched back the most powerful army that Europe had ever seen assembled and pushed it literally back to its capital. I mean,
right. So I mean, like,
and of course they're going to want some for that.
At this point, everyone's looking at Russia like, okay, fuck these guys. We can't let them. We just fucking got done dealing with Germany. We don't want to have to deal with this.
I think how crazy it is from a historical context. Like, they were like, we're cool just being Russia here. And it's like, Hitler's like, no, fuck you. I want your land too. And it's like, okay, now we're going to fuck you up, kill all you motherfuckers. And then we're just going to take all this land for ourselves and start really another global empire.
And everybody's like, wait, why do you get to take the land? It's like, well, because, he tried to take ours. We're taking yours
now. I think there's a real fear that, like, they're looking at this communist system and they're like, ooh, we don't really want to be that.
But yeah, Churchill definitely.
We're scared of the might that it gave, because, like, the Soviet Union, like, it industrialized Russia like pretty lickety fucking split. So a lot of these Western countries are looking at that like, oh shit. Well, we don't want that system to take root here because that's gonna fuck us.
And clearly Churchill recognized that, like, oh man, we've awakened like a fucking sleeping dragon here. Like,
Germany did, but you might have to deal with it.
He was one of the first people to he invented the term the Iron Curtain, which was used all the way through the 80s and into the 90s to describe the push of Russian influence into Eastern Europe.
And then the US, of course, did West Berlin, the massive airlifts, because the Soviets were like, well, we're around you. And it's like, okay, we'll just fly the shit in then. And it's like, okay, well, fuck, I guess we'll do that.
That is unfortunately a tale for another day. Interesting stuff here. If you're a patron and you like these enough that you think you'd like to hear a full-length episode, one of these, let me know. I love doing them. They're always fun to dip our toe into. Let me know what you think in the comments, and see you next time.
Deep bad pride. Deep bad pride.